In the best traditions of the interaction between government and the press, can you just, if you're making notes or tweeting, can you just put the word allegedly in front of everything that Tom has just attributed to the National Cybersecurity Centre? The building was indeed awarded the Carbuncle Cup, and there was a reference to the preening cockerel, which I'm told was a characterisation of the building and not the chief executive. At least that's what I was assured. Let me first start with an apology. I do have to run straight off, whether that's defending the digital realm. It's actually a conference of European cybersecurity leaders in Estonia, so it's really important. But I did want to come here. I want to say thanks to the CBI, thanks to fellow speakers, thanks to Tom for inviting me to come. I wish I could stay to enjoy such a comprehensive agenda, because looking through it, I think it captures the holistic and multifaceted approach of the problem that we face, and every aspect of that's important. I'm privileged, as Tom says, to be the first head of the new UK's new National Cybersecurity Centre, part of GCHQ. It's based over in Victoria, opened formally by Her Majesty the Queen in February this year. And as Tom said, we're trying to bring together in a single place the UK's operational cybersecurity work. And that's not an easy task, but it is, I think, an essential one. Because we face a strategic challenge. It's a global challenge, hence the summit in Estonia, but it's also a national challenge, and that really means national. It means everyone with a role to play, whether that's government, business, or the individual. And those three things, government, business, and the individual, are the focuses of what I'm going to say this morning, what each sector needs to think about, what each group needs to think about. And one thing that's common to all three is the importance of asking questions. So I'm going to start the day with emphasizing the importance of asking questions. It's been an important part of my own journey. When I joined GCHQ 3.5 years ago, the learning curve was very steep. The organisation I'm privileged to work in is jam-packed full of really bright, really creative, intuitive people who've forgotten more than I know about cybersecurity. So I ask questions constantly, and I'm still puzzled, but mostly in awe of the people who work for me and the innovative solutions that they find all the time. So I did ask them questions. Then we as a government started getting the confidence to ask questions about our own national record. Why do we care about cybersecurity at a national level? What then is the role of government? Which part of our society is key to our cyber defences? In what ways? Why haven't normal market forces taken care of more of the problem? And asking these questions amounted to nothing less than questioning a Western consensus on cybersecurity that had been around for nearly a decade. And that consensus said roughly four things. First, governments should focus on looking out for the high-end national security risks. Second, governments should form, rather vaguely described, but they should form partnerships with the private sector. Third, information sharing should be encouraged because it was seen as the answer to most of the problem. And fourth, the market would take care of the rest. But when we looked at this in 2015, a lot of this wasn't happening. The partnerships were there, but in some cases they weren't achieving much. Information sharing uptake beyond the finance sector was relatively poor. A lot of corporate, government and other defences were weaker than they should be. And so as a nation, we weren't where we needed to be. So the result of this questioning was the launch of the National Cybersecurity Strategy last year. And in it, we said we cared about cybersecurity for two reasons. One is national security. There is a threat to our way of life, and there is a threat to our critical services. And second, though, there is the threat to prosperity, the threat to our economic well-being from an aggregation of cyber attacks that could damage consumer confidence. So having identified those two threats, the government set up the National Cybersecurity Centre to deliver the response to the first threat and to provide the infrastructure for addressing the second. And I think the past year has shown that this is broadly the right framework, because over the past year, first and most obviously, we've seen the big state threat, traditional espionage with a modern twist that can now affect our very democracy, our critical national infrastructure, and the lens through which we view the world. And we've seen this all across the West. So these are the age-old national security dangers, the classic enemy tactics with brand new shiny tools and an ability to operate at greater scale. But second, there is just the fundamental threat to economic prosperity. We've had the most recent cybersecurity breaches survey with just under half of UK businesses identifying a breach or attack in the last 12 months. File loss, systems corrupted, access is denied, personal data stolen. And this is in one of the most digitally advanced and digitally dependent economies in the world. As a government, we absolutely have to manage public confidence in the digital economy, because if that confidence is lost, then this is a national economic problem if we get it wrong. It's a social priority too. As Tom mentioned, the WannaCry attack that affected the NHS in May was an example of the more severe end of the threat. The sheer scale of the attack globally, even if as an attack designed to gain money, it appears to have been largely unsuccessful, but also the wider social impact these attacks can have through damage to some relatively small NHS bodies in various parts of the country. And we've seen in the last week the attack on Equifax in the US, and with the Information Commissioner and the financial regulatory authorities, we're trying to examine the impact of on the UK, and we'll provide an update as soon as we can. So all this brings me to the response in the UK to these two areas of risk: national security and economic prosperity. What more should we, government, business, and the individual, the user, now be doing to have that effect, to bring about that change? So let's start with government. I'm a civil servant, so now for the boring bit, and I hope you've had coffee. There's a global cybersecurity industry of more than $100 billion per year. So every day we have to justify as government that we're not doing what the private sector could do. And the national security end, I think that's relatively straightforward conceptually. It's hard to do, but conceptually it's easy to understand. We've got GCHQ's secret intelligence capabilities. We've got groundbreaking partnerships with law enforcement, other governments, and global industry, and all that's helped to produce one of the more capable defences around the world. We're still vulnerable. Major attacks will happen, but we've made significant progress on national cyber defence at the very top level. Then on the business side, there's regulation, and I'm delighted that the Information Commissioner is here later to set out how she'll approach these changes, and we're working closely with her. From the government's perspective, shortly Parliament will see the new data protection bill. That will bring the UK's law into line with the EU's general data protection regulation by May of next year. So that regulation will require organisations that handle personal information to evaluate the risks of processing that sort of information and put in place measures to mitigate the risks. And so for many organisations, these measures will need to include effective cybersecurity controls. And there's a new obligation under GDPR to inform individuals of data breaches where significant personal information has been lost. Now, as I say, the Information Commissioner will set out how all this will be regulated. From the point of view of cybersecurity, there are at least two impacts of this. Firstly, it will, we hope, level the playing field of data loss. Perhaps sometimes a company at present their response may be governed by fear, and breaches will go unreported or be reported late or will be fixed before the full spectrum of checks have taken place. But under GDPR, the increased penalties should be a call to action for organisations to protect themselves and their customers from attack. And the fear that a competitor might be disguising the same issue should be removed. And secondly, the requirement under GDPR to report breaches should provide for us a reliable sort of data on the nature and scale of cyber incidents that the government and market can use in identifying attackers to provide a more robust insurance framework and help us all implement stronger protections. So that's the regulatory aspect. And from the government's point of view then, international partnerships is a very strong area of focus. So the forthcoming discussions in Estonia at my level, but also at ministerial level later in the month, are important for a number of reasons. As the government said in its paper on post-EU exit defence and security yesterday, our commitment to European security is unconditional, and cybersecurity is a key area where we've got a lot to offer. And thanks to the deep expertise of GCHQ and other bodies, the UK has, if not the most, certainly one of the most sophisticated understandings of the nature of the threat anywhere in Europe. And cybersecurity is a global problem that affects all the countries of Europe, whether in the EU or not. We have deep shared economic interests in areas like finance, and more practically, we have infrastructure interdependencies. So the threat to the West is one we all share. So post-departure, the UK wants and needs to be at the forefront in this defence of Europe and European values and interests from the current threat. Finally, there's the technical aspect. We've talked a lot about technical solutions to cybersecurity problems that we're starting to implement under what we call our Active Cyber Defence Programme. The purpose of this programme is to give the government a framework for UK cybersecurity, a framework that takes away most of the harm from most of the people, most of the time, automatically. It means things like identifying ingenious solutions to spoofing so we can block people from pretending to be who they aren't. It means really innovative partnerships, like our threat sharing scheme with the major communication service providers, which blocks tens of millions of attacks automatically every month. It means practical impacts like this, looking at a problem, understanding the implications, and working out how to fix it. So that's the sort of approach we want to see in the corporate sector as well, which is my second theme this morning. Clearly, for the business sector, the new regulations will be a big priority, as they should be. But let's not lose sight about what we're learning about what makes for an effective corporate response to cyber threats. Companies are really well used to thinking about risk and security in a very sophisticated way. But when it comes to cybersecurity, sometimes that clear-headed approach can disappear. There are a whole range of issues we could discuss, but I'll stick to just two: the conversation boardrooms need to have, and the experience of staff. Cybersecurity is still shrouded in mystique, and conversations around it are not always designed to dispel that fear, misunderstanding, and panic. Maybe that's why over a fifth of organization senior managers, according to surveys, are never given an update on cybersecurity issues. So in a boardroom, here are some of the questions you might ask at your board, or if you're a CISO, ones you might expect to be asked. What's on our network that we most care about? How can the services that depend on it be disrupted? Who has access to those sensitive details? Who administers it? Are they using the same internet-facing account to administer the system as they are to do normal internet-facing business? The top tip here is if the answer is no, check. If the answer is yes, count to 10 and then do something about it. Is the data backed up? And don't leave the subject till you understand the answers and are satisfied with the answers you've got. You might also want to ask whether you think you've got the right level of expertise in your team. The NCSC's Industry 100 scheme offers the opportunity for practitioners to develop their skills and give us a deeper understanding of your sector by working with us part or full-time for a fixed period. Please think about joining that scheme. Fundamentally, for a company dealing with cybersecurity, there are no stupid questions. Embarrassment about a lack of subject expertise mustn't stop us from asking questions to which we want the answers and not stopping asking them until we're satisfied. Because the topic is unfamiliar, it's easy to forget that underpinning it all are humans and human behavior. And that leads to the final point about the importance of the individual in all this. I think, and this is probably the most important point today, we haven't always made it easy for our people. Only 20% of all businesses have had their staff receive cybersecurity training or attend even some form of seminar in the past year. And even that isn't a panacea. Only 15% of delegates who take part in some of these programs exhibited the sort of behaviors and heightened awareness that the programs were designed to create. So let's get serious about understanding the human being in all this. Let's stop talking nonsense about humans being the weakest link in cybersecurity. It's a bit like saying the weakest link in a sports team is all the players. There's some really interesting stuff in academia which is leading the way. I'm an enormous fan of a study focusing on human factors by Shari Flieger, Angela Sassa, and Adrian Furnham. And this goes some way towards addressing these points about the working environment, about what our people are experiencing. So here's a quote. Human factors techniques can maximize human performance while ensuring safety and security. Their key principle is designing technology that fits a person's physical and mental abilities, fitting the task to the human. Just pause on that phrase, fitting the task to the human. So these academics say we need to get employees to be able to cope without training. At the very least, they tell us that what we have to put in place for our staff has to be usable. I think this is the single most important shift in thinking on cybersecurity over the past year or so, the wider recognition of the importance of the user. In digital services, we've got there some time ago. In government, for more than half a decade, the UK has led worldwide. The government digital service obliterated the sort of policy over behaviour groupthink that had pervaded government IT over previous decades. They delivered on what was then a revolutionary promise for big organisations, that every government official should have technology as good as you have at home. And that same progressive, simplifying, creative mindset is needed now. We've got lots of really good people working on it. You'll hear from Royal Holloway, one of our centres of excellence, later in the day. And we looked at this when we created the Active Cyber Defence Programme. What were the blockages to people behaving in a safer way? Part of it was guidance fatigue. Part of it was people being told they were always doing something wrong, but not knowing how to do the right things or not being able to follow the right things easily. So every solution has to survive contact with the user. That's why we changed some completely unworkable password guidance. Professor Sassa calculated this was the equivalent of remembering a new 600-digit number every month. So we now recommend that people protect very heavily what they can't afford to lose and do what they can with everything else. It was interesting that the author of the original guidance, the American Bill Burr, back in 2003, has now validated this. But he couldn't have known in 2003 that within a decade and a half we wouldn't be able to buy a book without needing to remember which song we'd plundered for our credentials. So to get cybersecurity right, we need to connect those human factors to that boardroom conversation. We need to make sure that everyone using a network understands how to use it safely. And we need to make sure that at corporate level, we understand that's just as important as investing in the network security technology. Networks have users. They're for users. And if users can't do their work effectively while understanding how to do it safely, then security is reduced to the point where it won't work. If you remember nothing else from this talk, our message is that leaders at all levels in organizations could do worse than check if they themselves can follow and operate the sort of security procedures that they expect their staff to follow. We need to fit the task to the human. And if we do this, it will help us raise national defences as a whole. That's the most important thing we can do as a country. That will strengthen not just national security, but prosperity too. The National Cybersecurity Centre is here to help identify the right questions and provide the right framework. It's an ambitious mission, and we won't get everything right, of course, but we can, with you, make a real difference, and we hope make the UK the safest place to live and do business online. So please do come with us on that journey, and thank you for listening this morning.